I will. So thank you. We had a little bit of a summer and early fall break from the seminar between people traveling and vacations and one small cancellation. But here we are again, and we already have lined up a few more. So before I introduce our speaker today, next month we'll have John Murillo, who's present here. We'll be giving a talk in Spanish about Graphenrieda, the genus Graphenrieda. We'll be sending all the information shortly after this seminar. So today, I want to introduce Kate Samra, who will be talking to us about Trioleneae. Kate did her undergrad in Michigan, at the University of Michigan, and then she spent some time at Kew Gardens working with Yves Lucas on Myrtaceae from Eastern Brazil, and then came to New York, worked here in the herbarium in different jobs. She was intern on some digitation project, was a mounter in the herbarium. And then when things sort of started to calm down after they shut down and all that, she went back to Kew for a little bit over a year to work on her master's. And while she was here in New York, we talked about the possibility of working on some things together and working over there at Kew with Eve that works on Myrtaceae, not Melastomataceae, but we're close enough, so we like them too. So then from all of that came her project on Trioleneae. Kate is back in New York City now. She's here at the garden today, and we're seeing what happens next soon, we hope. She will have news. And but anyway, Kate, please take it away and let us know what you're going to be talking about.
Great. Thank you, Fabian, and thank you all so much for joining this morning. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, can you all see this all right and hear me?
Yes, we can see it and we can hear you well.
Awesome. Okay, so as Fabian mentioned, I've been working in this really neat tribe of melastomes, Trioleneae. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've done the past year or so. So my research diverged a few different directions over the course of the semester. So first, I'm going to give you kind of a broad introduction to this group of plants, and then I'll talk about each of the chapters of my thesis individually. And then I'm looking forward to taking any questions that you might have at the end or just having a discussion as well. Right, so this is the tribe Trioleneae. There's two genera in the tribe, Monolina and Trioleneae, about 45 species altogether. And these are all understory herbs. They grow terrestrially, but we also find them as epiphytes on branches and trunks and logs, and also as lithophytes on rocks. And their distribution spans from southern Mexico down through the northern Andes into Bolivia, and then some of the species kind of trickle into western Amazonia as well. So there's a couple of really neat things I want to share with you about these plants. One is their splash cup fruits. So these fruits are dehiscent, they're abiotically dispersed, they dry out, and then as the name suggests, they actually rely on water to splash into these cups and then kind of projectile these tiny seeds out. So we only find these plants in really wet, dense areas of the understory, and most often in and along running water, like rivers, streams, and waterfalls. So they have this very restricted niche. Another really cool thing about some of the plants in the genus Trioleneae is they exhibit anisophylly. And anisophylly is this leaf morphology in opposite-leaved taxa, where one of the opposing leaves is really reduced in size compared to the other. So at first glance, that herbarium specimen on the top right might appear alternate leaves, but actually one of the leaves is just really small, and that's anisophylly. So we'll talk a little bit more about anisophylly later on in the presentation. So let's dive into chapter 1 of my thesis, which is this synoptic checklist of the group. So the last complete revision of the genera now included in the tribe was 1891. So it obviously lacks the majority of species now accepted in the group. On top of that, there's a bit of a complicated taxonomy. So 16 of the names have been transferred from 3 different genera. On top of that, many of the type specimens for the group were first collected by this Colombian botanist, J.J. Trioleneae, and Trioleneae used kind of a complex cataloging system. There's actually only 2 copies of his notes in the world, one at the herbarium in Bogota and one at the Natural History Museum library in London. So a couple of those images on the right that you see are from a little field trip that I took to the Natural History Museum library to view his original notes and reconcile some issues with collection numbers and type locality information, and those aided in my lectotypifications. But overall, I think these issues kind of represent a gap in our knowledge of the taxonomy and distributions and ecology in the species in Trioleneae. Right, so this is why we put together this synopsis. I know that you all are probably very familiar with what a checklist looks like, and it's not the most riveting information to present. So I'm just going to briefly run through an example of a checklist entry and also talk about some of the overall outcomes of the checklist. So we have 14 new lectotypes designated, prioritizing the country of collection. In this case, prioritizing the home herbarium of the authority. We've listed 16 homotypic and 5 heterotypic synonyms. I've cited 37 illustrations that I thought could prove useful for further taxonomic research. We have validated district level distributions, as well as elevation, habit, and habitat notes for each species. So no taxonomic decisions were made for this checklist, but we have discussed affinities, distinctions, 6 potential synonyms, and 4 groups of possibly undescribed species. Some miscellaneous notes on certain complex typification decisions. In this case, there was a misspelling of the epithet in 1963 when the name was transferred, so we've corrected that here. Preliminary IUCN red list assessments for each species. And then I've cited over 150 representative specimens that I used to compile those district level distributions. And Trioleneae hygrophila, my example here, does not have any plant uses that we know of, but 5 of the species in the tribe did. So I've captured that information in the checklist as well. So my master's project actually originally included sampling and sequencing, and we were hoping to build a more complete tree of Trioleneae, but the sequences came back a bit too late. But I'm hoping that the culmination of all of this information in the checklist kind of provides a stepping stone for a more complete revision of Trioleneae in the future that would combine both molecular analysis and more thorough examination of all the available material. In that vein, I've hoped to capture all of the synopsis data in what I hope to publish as supplementary material. So these are direct links to protologs, translated protologs from Latin, all of the holotype, lectotype specimens, those illustrations I cited, selected specimens, the list goes on and on. But my hope here is that if myself or if anyone else chooses to study Trioleneae in the future, that we have a really accessible jumping off point for this group. I'd like to briefly discuss the red list assessments that I conducted. So in addition to looking at area of occupancy, extent of occurrence, and number of populations, I also considered specific threats to each species, most often habitat loss from things like development, logging, agriculture. I also took into account their restricted habitat. So again, we only find these plants in the dense or understory and most often in and along running water. And then finally, I looked at protected area overlap. And the reason I think we're seeing over a third of the species in this group falling into threatened categories is because of this large gap in protected area in the Chocó region of Colombia, which is actually where we see the highest degree of species richness and endemism for the tribe. So moving on to chapter 2, which is a new species to science that we've submitted. So when I was cleaning the GBIF data, I noticed that a group of specimens identified as Trioleneae lanceolata did not match the type of Trioleneae lanceolata and were actually quite morphologically and geographically distinct. So we requested some material from Missouri and Cal Academy of Sciences, and when it arrived at Kew, Fabian actually happened to be in town at the same time. So we described what we've named as Trioleneae anisophylly, named for its really extremely anisophylous leaves, which we're seeing in the central image there. And I've assessed this species as endangered. It grows in this very small region of Panama, and one of the occurrence points overlaps with now an active mining site in the region. And this mining company actually just recently proposed a significant expansion to that mining concession that would overlap with even more of those species occurrences. Okay, so moving on to chapter 3. As I was starting to get to know these plants, I became really fascinated with this leaf morphological trait, anisophylly, which I mentioned earlier. So I started doing some research on it. I found that it's present in several, mostly tropical plant families, but we really don't know much about it. It's been hypothesized that it's an adaptive trait to prevent self-shading in the dense understory. And I think the genus Trioleneae is a really ideal group to study this in, because one of the species is isophylous, so essentially equal-leaved. Most of the species exhibit what the literature calls lateral anisophylly. So this is really variable anisophylly. Sometimes it's only produced in the lateral shoots of a plant, and it really ranges, as I mentioned, very variably from 40% to isophylous. So that's 17 species in the genus. And then the rest of the species exhibit what we call habitual anisophylly. So this is really extreme anisophylly. It's always present throughout the entire plant at all ages. And as I mentioned, it's extreme. So one leaf pair or one leaf is less than a third of the length of the opposing. So I wanted to first ask this question: is anisophylly associated with canopy density? Because this is the primary hypothesis that has been presented over the years. So I took the cleaned occurrence data from the synoptic checklist, and I spatially thinned that at a threshold of 10 kilometers. And then I extracted a value of canopy density from this NASA data set, which is what you're seeing in B. That's an example of a raster that I used for these extractions. But when I ran a simple t-test against those habitual species and lateral species, I actually found no difference in percent tree cover. But I do think it's quite possible that this data might not be able to accurately capture canopy density at a fine enough scale, especially for a group of plants that we already know only really occurs in the dense understory in the first place. So this was interesting, but it didn't quite satisfy me. It left me with more questions than answers. So I asked, well, what else affects plant traits? We know that climate can affect plant traits, and in particular, climate can drive leaf adaptations. So my next question was, is anisophylly associated with climate? So on the left here, you're seeing distribution models showing habitat suitability for those habitual and lateral species occurrences that I ran with extracted world climate data, again, from those thinned and cleaned occurrences. And on the right, I've plotted anisophylly on a Sanger phylogeny of the genus. And I'm plotting anisophylly as a continuous trait in terms of leaf ratio, but also showing how it falls into those discrete categories of lateral and habitual and isophylous. Okay, so there's a couple of really interesting things I think we can gather from these results. So if we look at that habitat suitability, we see that those habitually anisophylous species occur in a much smaller geographic area and appear to have a more restricted climatic niche compared to the lateral species. And if we take a look at the tree, we see it appears there's strong phylogenetic signal there, but I also see an ecological trend. In particular, if we look at Trioleneae amazonica, which is a laterally anisophylous species within that habitual clade, it actually follows the broader niche of those other lateral species. And I've highlighted that as triangles on the map there. So we can see that Trioleneae amazonica extends much further east and south along with those other lateral anisophylous species. So what exactly is the climatic niche of each group? So these are probability of presence curves for the top climatic variables that my modeling produced. So if we look at the top variable on the left, precipitation during the warmest quarter, we see that those habitual species actually require a much higher threshold of precipitation compared to the lateral species. If we look at isothermality on the right, we see that the habitual species require a higher threshold of isothermality, kind of thrive in isothermic conditions, where those lateral species do not require that threshold and also kind of peter out at a certain level of isothermality. So I'm starting to see some patterns in habitual anisophylous species being associated with high precipitation and isothermality. I wanted to look at this on a finer gradient. I couldn't find any kind of reasonable bioregionalization of the area of study. So what I did was I extracted WWF ecoregions for all of my occurrence data, and then I grouped those into 6 larger ecoregions. First, I consider this existing grouping that was done by the original authors of the ecoregions, and then I looked at proximity, climate, geography, and satellite terrain to group the rest of them. So the map that you're seeing on this slide is the final grouped ecoregions that I'll be talking about in the next slides. So I wanted to look at mean annual precipitation because precipitation kept coming up as a top climatic variable in my modeling. So these are the habitual and lateral species occurrences within each ecoregion, showing mean annual precipitation. And again, I think there's a couple of really neat things that we can gather from these box plots. So one, we see that those habitual species are found in areas of higher precipitation within each ecoregion compared to the lateral species and to the ecoregion mean annual precipitation. Along that line, we also see that the habitual species are actually excluded from the ecoregions with the lowest mean annual precipitation. So I wanted to go one step further and ask if we could see these same patterns epigenetically in a laterally anisophylous species, Trioleneae hirsuta. So Trioleneae hirsuta is the most widespread species in Trioleneae, and it exhibits lateral anisophily, so really variable, ranging from 40% to isophylous. And what I did was I measured the severity of anisophily in specimens, so essentially just the inverse of the measured ratio. And I did that for specimens with coordinates or specimens that could be reasonably georeferenced. Again, I extracted world climate data after spatially thinning those occurrences, and then I looked for patterns between severity of anisophily and those climatic variables. And what I found was a weak but significant regression between precipitation of the warmest quarter and anisophily severity in Trioleneae hirsuta. So as precipitation of the warmest quarter increases, so does the severity of anisophily in this species. I also looked at anisophylly severity in those grouped ecoregions. That's what you're seeing on the right here. And these results were insignificant, but I do think it's worth noting that we see the highest severity of anisophylly in the Choco-Darien region, which is also where we see the highest proportion of habitually anisophilous species. So I think all of these results provide evidence that anisophylly is associated with higher precipitation and isothermality in the genus Trioleneae. And I think we can see this both cladistically across the genus, but also at the population level in Trioleneae hirsuta. I think it's possible that these trends in precipitation that we're seeing are actually serving as a kind of proxy for dense forest cover and or cloud cover in the region. So the Choco region, which is again where we see the highest severity of lateral anisophylly and the highest proportion of habitual species, actually is covered with some of the densest cloud cover in the world. So perhaps anisophylly is this adaptive trait to prevent self-shading, but it's been driven more so by cloud cover and less so by canopy cover, or a combination of the two. And I do want to reiterate that it's quite possible that that canopy density data that I originally worked with was unable to kind of accurately capture the dense understory microhabitats in this group. So I wanted to kind of discuss or share some further hypotheses or questions that I have now, having gotten these results. In particular, I've been thinking about anisophylly as a functional trait. So functional traits are, by the most widely accepted definition, traits that affect fitness via growth, reproduction, or survival. And I told you that we don't know much about anisophylly, but one of the papers I did find found that lateral anisophylly increased biomass efficiency in this species in Garryaceae, which suggests that lateral anisophylly is actually advantageous to photosynthetic capacity, which would in turn imply that lateral anisophylly is a functional trait. So now I'm really curious about if these traits have potentially driven the distribution of these groups of Trioleneae. So perhaps habitual anisophylly represents this kind of highly adaptive but potentially restrictive trait, where lateral anisophylly represents a more flexible and functional trait that is allowed for a much broader geographic distribution and less restricted niche. Another obvious question for me here is we've observed lower precipitation and longer periods of drought in the tropics in recent years, and I think it's quite possible that these trends could further restrict suitable habitat for those habitually anisophilous species relative to the lateral species. I talked a lot about how many of these species are threatened, and I just wanted to share this positive news that fairly recently, UNESCO declared a new biosphere reserve in the Choco region of Colombia, where many of these species are endemic to, as I mentioned. So I don't have the boundaries of this protected area yet, but I'm very keen to see how it overlaps with some of those threatened occurrence points. Yeah, I want to thank Eve and Fabian and a few others for their help throughout this work. And yeah, I'm looking forward to taking any questions you might have, and I've included my email as well in case you're interested in reaching out. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. That was awesome. We have already a couple of questions in the chat, and anybody that wants to ask a question, just unmute yourself and go ahead. Or you, if you are shy, you can just write the questions and one of us will read it. Darren, do you want to ask your question, or you want me to ask it? I guess Darren is shy, so I will ask. So Darren says that, very nice. The synopsis spreadsheet, and he wants to know if that is publicly available. I know the answer, but I want you to.
Yes, we're actually working on publishing the synopsis right now, so we're hoping to attach that as supplementary material. If you're interested in getting a hold of it before then, I'm happy to share it.
Thank you. So before people get shy, I'm gonna stop being shy. I'm gonna sort of follow up a little bit. I think one of the coolest things here is to find the same response at the population level, the Trioleneae hirsuta, of having this correlation of anisophylly with rain, that you find at the species level, at a more evolutionary level. Do you think that this can explain, can this be like a mechanism of selection that would explain how the character gets fixed later? Or you think that these things are sort of independent?
I think it could certainly explain why it would be fixed later on. Yeah, I'd be interested in kind of looking for more examples of how we see traits at the population level, but also, like you said, fixed across a group of plants or a group of taxa as well. Yeah, I have a feeling, but yeah, I don't know.
And sort of follow up to that, what do you think happened with Trioleneae amazonica?
What do I think happened?
So what is in a clade? It's in a clade of things with habitual anisophylly, but it is not.
Right. It almost like escaped that habitual anisophylly. And we see it much further into Amazonia and south and east, right? So I don't know, I think it goes back to my kind of hypothesis of that lateral anisophylly as a functional trait. So or perhaps it's advantageous to be able to have different leaf sizes, and that's allowed it to expand much further in that direction. But
it's like a reversal to.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, would the data be available to do the same population level study on Trioleneae amazonica?
Sorry, say that again.
So I was just wondering whether the data would be available to do the same that you did with Trioleneae hirsuta, but with Trioleneae amazonica.
Yeah, it would be. I think the reason I chose Trioleneae hirsuta was because we had many more specimens of it available. But yeah, that's a great idea to test that hypothesis in Amazonica as well. Thanks, Leopold.
I have a question. Kate, thank you. That was an awesome presentation. I was wondering if you think you would be able to pick up any signal of like positive diversification because of this anisophylly. This is a new word for me. Anisophylly, just due to like it being able to like expand the distribution that was previously available.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. I actually don't think I'm familiar with the term positive diversification. Could you explain that?
Just increases in diversification, whether it affected diversification to create more biodiversity.
You mean like a faster rates of evolution?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, perhaps. It's further along in that phylogeny we have. So I'd be interested to see. Are you aware of any like packages or workflows to test for positive diversification? Okay, interesting. We'll have to talk because that sounds like a really interesting question to explore.
We need to add more species to the phylogeny to really be able to do that.
Yeah.
Which we're doing. Yeah. So, any other comments, questions?
Yeah, I do have a question.
Unmuted himself.
Yes.
Go ahead, Diego.
Hi, Kate. Nice presentation. Thanks for that. I have sort of a classical question at this point. What do you think about how much of underrepresented either areas or specimens / species might be affecting the patterns that you're seeing with the anisophylly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this group needs a lot of work. All of the South American species have never actually been formally treated since that last revision. So I think, you know, as well as the gap in protected area we see in the Choco region, I think there's a gap in study there as well. And just from doing that taxonomic work in the checklist, I see that as I mentioned, we've referred to 6 potential synonyms and 4 groups of possibly undescribed species. And yeah, I think that this research would definitely benefit from more for, I guess, running the same analyses potentially when we have a more complete phylogeny and a better idea of the tribe as well.
Nice, thank you.
So Mary Claire in Munich is saying, very nice presentation. It will be great to test this. I mean, I assume she means the anisophylly patterns in Amphiblema and Cicinobotris. Those are 2 other genera in that also have the same type of habit and the same type of splash cups and so forth. They look very similar to Trioleneae and Bertolonias, and you know, they are in a different tribe, Sonorili, but they do have that very same look. Or we could also you know, look at it more carefully. You know, it'd be interesting to look at that also in Bertolonia. Bertolonia, there's really not so much an anisophylly, but there is a few species with fully alternate leaves. So they've gone like completely to the extreme. They're in the Mata Atlantica, so that would be a different thing.
Yeah, I think kind of a logical next step for these questions also is expanding them into all melastomes or all plants and seeing if we can pick up on these same climatic patterns that we're seeing in a larger group. So I've actually been kind of compiling a group of other anisophilous taxa. So if you have any, thank you, Mary Claire, for sharing those. But if anyone can think of any, please let me know.
Well, this was short and sweet. Love the presentation. Very good. We don't have any other questions? One.
I just have one more.
Oh,
for you,
great.
Kate.
Yeah, we have a lot of time.
When you were describing your new species, I was just wondering, like, as you were in the herbarium, was it like an easy thing for you to parse out as you were going through specimens, or was this more like a gradual looking at a bunch of specimens and then seeing that there were differences?
So I was looking at GBIF data actually when I noticed that what is now a new species was just, it did not match the type of what it was identified, and there were several of them that just looked exactly like it, and they were really pretty morphologically distinct. But I was of course a little nervous to come to Fabian and Eve like a month into my project and be like, this isn't working, or this isn't right. But I ended up showing them, and they were like, yeah, let's, you know, request some material and see what's there. So yeah, and it just worked out that Fabian was in London literally the same day that the sheets arrived from Missouri and California. So yeah.
It was paying attention, I would call it. Yeah. Well, next month, I don't have the date, but it's it will be the 3rd Wednesday in November. We'll have John Steven Murillo, who's here still, talking to us about Graphenrieta. We'll be sending the announcement, title, photos, etc. soon. And so thank you, Kate. This was awesome. And we'll be posting this on the web, on the website soon as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, great.
Bye-bye.